In the autumn of 1857, the Whitmore plantation in Talbot County, Georgia, stood as a testament to the antebellum prosperity that defined the region. The main house, a Georgian colonial structure with white columns and expansive verandas, overlooked rolling fields of cotton that stretched toward the Chattahoochee River. What happened within those walls during the winter months of that year would remain buried in family records for over a century, surfacing only when a graduate student at the University of Georgia discovered a cache of letters in 1964. The Whitmore family had owned the plantation for 3 generations. Charles Whitmore, then 28 years old, had inherited the property following his father's death in 1856. Unlike many plantation owners of his generation, Charles had received a classical education at Harvard College, returning to Georgia with ideas that his neighbors found unsettling. He spoke of modernizing agricultural techniques and had been heard discussing the writings of Northern abolitionists, though always in hushed tones. The household staff consisted of 43 enslaved individuals who lived in quarters behind the main house. Among them was a woman known only as Sarah in the surviving records. Church baptismal records from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in nearby Columbus list her age as 22 in 1857, and though the accuracy of such documentation regarding enslaved persons remained questionable. What is known from multiple sources is that Sarah had been assigned to work within the main house, specifically maintaining the upstairs chambers and the master's private study. The discovery that would eventually shed light on the events at Whitmore Plantation came to academic attention through Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a doctoral candidate researching antebellum domestic arrangements. While examining papers donated to the university by the Whitmore estate, she uncovered a collection of letters hidden beneath the false bottom of a mahogany writing desk. The correspondence, written in Charles Whitmore's distinctive hand, revealed a psychological deterioration that began in December of 1857. The first letter, dated December 3, 1857, was addressed to his cousin Edward in Savannah, but never sent. In it, Charles wrote of strange dreams and an increasing inability to concentrate on plantation business. He mentioned Sarah by name, describing her as uncommonly intelligent for her station, and noting that she had been teaching herself to read using books from his library. What troubled him, he wrote, was not her thirst for knowledge, but his own reaction to her presence in his private chambers. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantations suggest that Charles had begun exhibiting erratic behavior by mid-December. Colonel James Hartwell, whose property bordered the Whitmore land, noted in his own diary that Charles had become increasingly reclusive, cancelling social engagements and avoiding the county's winter gatherings. The overseer, a man named Thomas Kendrick, reported to other plantation owners that the master had taken to spending entire days locked in his study, emerging only for solitary meals. The psychological tension that built within the Whitmore household during those winter months can be traced through a series of increasingly disturbing entries found in what appeared to be Charles's private journal. The journal, written in a cipher that was not decoded until 1966, revealed the depth of his internal conflict. He wrote extensively about Sarah's daily presence in his room, describing the way she moved through the space with what he called a dignity that defied her circumstances. According to the decoded journal entries, Charles found himself timing his movements through the house to coincide with Sarah's cleaning schedule. He would position himself to observe her work from doorways and corners, studying her expressions and mannerisms with an intensity that he himself recognized as inappropriate. In one particularly revealing entry dated December 18th, he wrote of watching her dust his bookshelves and feeling a pull toward her that violated every principle of my upbringing and station. The winter of 1857 proved unusually harsh for Georgia. Snow fell twice in December, an unusual occurrence that left the plantation isolated for days at a time. The enforced isolation seemed to intensify whatever psychological crisis was developing within Charles. Kitchen staff later reported to investigators that he had begun taking his meals at irregular hours, often requesting that specific servants deliver his food. Sarah's name appeared frequently in these requests. The breakthrough in understanding what transpired came through a letter discovered in 1868 by a genealogist researching the Hartwell family. Colonel Hartwell had received a disturbing visit from Charles Whitmore on December 22, 1857. In his account of the visit, Hartwell described Charles as appearing wild-eyed and speaking in fragments about the corrupting influence of proximity to inferior races. Charles had confessed to Hartwell that he was experiencing unnatural thoughts about one of his house servants. Hartwell's letter to his brother in Charleston provided crucial details about Charles's mental state. According to Hartwell, Charles spoke of feeling as though he was losing his essential nature through daily contact with Sarah. He described her intelligence as unsettling and admitted that he found himself engaging her in conversation about books and ideas, interactions that he knew violated fundamental social boundaries of the era. The situation reached its crisis point on Christmas Eve of 1857. A fragment of testimony recorded decades later by a former slave named Moses, who had worked in the Whitmore house, described the events of that evening. Moses, interviewed by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1868, recalled being awakened by voices from the master's study. He described hearing Charles's voice, elevated and agitated, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. According to Moses's testimony, Sarah emerged from the study that night, carrying herself differently than before. He described her as moving like someone who had seen the devil himself, and noted that she spoke to no one for several days afterward. Other household staff reported that Sarah had requested reassignment to field work immediately after Christmas, an unusual request given the status that housework represented within the plantation hierarchy. The psychological documentation of Charles's condition continued through his private writings well into January of 1858. His journal entries from this period revealed a man grappling with what he perceived as his own moral corruption. He wrote of Sarah with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, describing her as representing everything that threatens the natural order, while simultaneously acknowledging his inability to dismiss her from his thoughts. One particularly chilling entry, dated January 4, 1858, described an encounter in his study where Charles claimed to have lost control of his faculties entirely. He wrote of speaking to Sarah in ways that he knew were inappropriate, confessing thoughts and feelings that he characterized as beyond redemption. The entry ended abruptly with the words, "I should not feel this way about her, yet I am powerless to prevent it." And the resolution of the immediate crisis came through the intervention of Charles's uncle, a Presbyterian minister from Atlanta, who arrived at the plantation in late January. Reverend William Whitmore's own correspondence, found among church records in 1963, revealed that he had been summoned by Colonel Hartwell, who feared that Charles was experiencing a complete mental breakdown. The Reverend's letters to his wife described finding Charles in a state of religious mania, alternating between periods of confession and rage. Sarah's fate during this period remained largely undocumented until the discovery of a bill of sale dated February 15, 1858. The document, found in Talbot County Courthouse records, showed that she had been sold to a plantation owner in Alabama for a price significantly below market value. The sale was conducted with unusual haste, and contemporary records suggest that Charles had insisted on her immediate removal from the property. The aftermath of these events cast a long shadow over the Whitmore family. Charles never married, despite social expectations and family pressure. His cousin Edward's letters, discovered in the Savannah Historical Society archives, referenced Charles's peculiar melancholy and his tendency to withdraw from society during the winter months. The plantation itself began to decline under Charles's increasingly erratic management, with crop yields falling and several neighboring property owners expressing concern about his treatment of the enslaved population. By 1859, Charles had become something of a local pariah. His anti-slavery sentiments, which had once been merely unusual for his social circle, evolved into what contemporaries described as an obsession. He began corresponding with Northern abolitionists and speaking openly about the corrupting influence of slavery on white society. These pronouncements, viewed through the lens of what had transpired with Sarah, took on a deeply personal character that made his neighbors increasingly uncomfortable. The psychological toll of the events of 1857 continued to manifest in Charles's behavior for years afterward. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of his later correspondence revealed patterns consistent with what modern psychology might recognize as post-traumatic stress. He wrote frequently of sleepless nights, intrusive thoughts, and a persistent sense of having compromised his fundamental identity. In one letter to a Northern minister dated 1860, he described feeling as though he had gazed into an abyss that reflected my own moral corruption. The Civil War brought an end to the Whitmore Plantation's operation, though Charles survived the conflict. Union records from 1864 show that he actively assisted in the liberation of enslaved persons from neighboring properties, actions that resulted in his being ostracized from local society entirely. After the war, he moved to Philadelphia, where he spent his remaining years working with freedmen's organizations, though those who knew him described him as a broken man who spoke little of his past. Sarah's story largely disappears from the historical record after her sale to the Alabama plantation. Efforts by researchers in the 1960s to trace her fate through Freedmen's Bureau records proved unsuccessful. The Alabama plantation where she was sent was destroyed during the war, and its records were lost. However, a single reference in a letter written by a Union soldier in 1864 mentioned encountering an unnamed woman who claimed to have once worked at a Georgia plantation and described experiencing treatment that had marked her spirit permanently. The psychological dynamics revealed through the Whitmore case provided historians with rare insight into the complex emotional and mental health impacts of slavery on both enslaved persons and slave owners. Dr. Thornfield's analysis, published in a limited academic journal in 1967, argued that the case demonstrated how the inherent violence of the slavery system created psychological damage that extended far beyond physical abuse. The documentation suggests that Charles's attraction to Sarah was intertwined with his recognition of her intelligence and humanity, factors that challenged the dehumanizing worldview necessary to maintain the slavery system. His journals revealed a man caught between societal expectations and personal recognition of Sarah's full humanity, a conflict that ultimately proved psychologically destructive for both parties involved. The broader implications of the Whitmore case extended beyond individual psychological damage. The correspondence and contemporary accounts revealed how such incidents were managed within antebellum society, with families and communities closing ranks to protect reputations while ensuring that enslaved persons who had been victimized were quickly removed from the situation. The speed with which Sarah was sold and the below-market price suggest that her removal was prioritized over financial considerations. Modern analysis of the surviving documents indicates that what occurred between Charles and Sarah likely involved emotional and psychological manipulation rather than physical violence, though the power dynamics inherent in the slavery system meant that any interaction between them was fundamentally coercive. Sarah's request for reassignment and her subsequent behavior suggest someone who had experienced severe psychological trauma, even if the specific details remain undocumented. The winter months at Whitmore Plantation in 1857 and 1858 represented a microcosm of the broader psychological violence inherent in the slavery system. The case demonstrated how the institution corrupted human relationships on multiple levels, creating situations where normal human emotions and attractions became vehicles for exploitation and harm. Charles's recognition of this corruption, evident in his later writings, did nothing to undo the damage that had been done to Sarah. The legacy of these events continued to impact the Whitmore family for generations. Charles's nephew, writing in the 1920s, described family gatherings where certain topics were never discussed, and certain rooms in inherited homes were kept perpetually closed. The psychological weight of what had transpired seemed to pass down through family lines, creating a culture of silence around specific aspects of their antebellum history. The academic discovery of the Whitmore documents in 1964 occurred during a period of increasing scholarly interest in the psychological impacts of slavery. Dr. Thornfield's research was among the first to examine primary source documents that revealed the emotional and mental health consequences of the institution from multiple perspectives. Her work influenced a generation of historians who began to explore the psychological dimensions of slavery more systematically. The methodology Dr. Thornfield developed for analyzing the Whitmore documents became a model for similar research. Her approach combined traditional historical analysis with emerging understanding of trauma psychology, creating a framework for interpreting historical documents that revealed psychological distress. This methodology proved particularly valuable for understanding cases where the primary victims had left little direct testimony. The physical spaces where these events occurred continued to bear witness long after the participants were gone. Visitors to the former Whitmore Plantation site in the 1950s and 60s reported an oppressive atmosphere, particularly in the areas where the main house had stood. Local residents spoke of the property feeling heavy and described experiencing unusual sensations when passing the location, though these accounts remained largely anecdotal. The rooms where Charles and Sarah's interactions took place were described in family records as being kept shuttered for decades after the events. When the house was finally demolished in 1943, workers reportedly found the master's study exactly as it had been left in 1858, with books still open on the desk and personal items arranged as if their owner had simply stepped away temporarily. The psychological echo of that winter extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire community surrounding the plantation. Neighboring families developed what appeared to be collective amnesia regarding certain events, with family histories and local records conspicuously avoiding mention of the Whitmore situation despite its obvious impact on local society. This silence persisted for over a century, only being broken when academic research brought the hidden documents to light. The case also illustrated the intersection between individual psychological crisis and broader social upheaval. Charles's breakdown occurred during a period when the slavery system was facing increasing external pressure and internal contradictions. His personal crisis mirrored the larger psychological tensions within Southern society, as traditional justifications for slavery became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of moral and practical challenges. Sarah's experience represented that of countless enslaved women who faced similar situations, but whose stories were never documented or preserved. The fragments of evidence surrounding her case suggested a pattern of psychological manipulation and exploitation that was likely far more common than historical records indicate. Her intelligence and literacy, factors that made her particularly vulnerable to Charles's attention, also enabled her to understand more fully the nature of what was happening to her. The transformation that both Charles and Sarah underwent during those winter months illustrated the profound human cost of an institution that reduced people to property while requiring daily intimate contact between oppressor and oppressed. The psychological damage documented in Charles's writings suggested that the slavery system was destructive to the mental health of everyone it touched, though the impacts were obviously far more severe for those who were enslaved. The academic debate surrounding Dr. Thornfield's interpretation of the Whitmore documents continued into the 1970s, with some scholars questioning whether the psychological framework she applied was appropriate for historical analysis. Critics argued that applying modern understanding of trauma and mental health to historical figures created anachronistic interpretations that distorted rather than illuminated the past. However, supporters of Dr. Thornfield's approach argued that the documents themselves provided evidence of psychological distress that transcended historical periods. Charles's own words described experiences that aligned closely with modern understanding of moral injury and psychological trauma, suggesting that these phenomena existed regardless of whether contemporary frameworks existed to understand them. The broader implications of the Whitmore case for understanding antebellum society continued to influence historical scholarship throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The documents provided rare insight into the private thoughts and experiences of both slave owners and enslaved persons, revealing dimensions of the slavery experience that had previously remained hidden from historical analysis. The case also demonstrated the importance of examining family archives and private correspondence for understanding historical trauma. The letters and journals that revealed the Whitmore story had been deliberately hidden, suggesting that similar documents might exist in other family collections, waiting to shed light on experiences that official records never captured. The silence that surrounded the Whitmore case for over a century reflected broader patterns of collective amnesia that characterized how antebellum communities dealt with incidents that challenged their social order. When Dr. Thornfield published her preliminary findings in 1967, several families in Talbot County contacted the university requesting that certain names be redacted from any future publications. The academic response to these requests revealed ongoing tensions about how historical trauma should be studied and discussed. The final pieces of the Whitmore puzzle emerged in 1968, when renovation work at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church uncovered additional documents hidden beneath floorboards in the vestry. Among these papers was a confession written by Charles Whitmore in 1861, apparently intended for his minister, but never delivered. In this document, Charles described the events of December 24, 1857 in greater detail, acknowledging that his behavior towards Sarah had crossed boundaries that he knew were wrong, regardless of social conventions. The confession revealed that Charles had trapped Sarah in his study that Christmas Eve, using his authority to force a conversation about her intelligence and his feelings toward her. He